Hello all. In this class and the next class, we'll be discussing a new topic, that is the American War of Independence, otherwise known as the American Revolution. You must be wondering why we are studying British history. Why are we here studying about the American War of Independence or the American Revolution? The answer is that as part of expansion, as part of expanding their empire, the colonial empire, as part of imperialism, Britain had established colonies in the new world that was America. You must have studied earlier how the geographical discoveries in the 15th century and 16th century had led travelers from Europe to find out, to discover new places in Asia, Africa and America. So America was discovered, and we have to know that Britain established 13 colonies there. So these colonies experienced a rule of colonial indifferences. These colonies felt that they were not ruled the way that they wanted to, and these colonies felt very unhappy under the British rule. So they revolted. So that is why we are studying about the American War of Independence in this segment, or in this semester of British history. So the American War of Independence, let me tell you, was very different from the English Revolution that we studied. Okay, let us see how. It was very different from the Glorious Revolution or the Palace Revolution, which we studied in the last class. So here you could see at the end, the net result was the establishment of a very powerful state on the basis of the ideals, noble ideals of democracy and liberalism, which of course did not happen in the case of the Glorious Revolution. Then the other point is that it was a nationalist revolution rather than a social revolution. It was in fact a revolution which involved the participation of all the people. It was in fact the national sentiment that they had kept them united. That's why we say that it was a nationalist revolution. Now, again, the other point I can say was how it was characterized by the growth of a very powerful bourgeois class, and that which opposed the conservative feudal absolutist system. So the bourgeois class, the trading class, those who aspired to hold positions and those who wanted power. So the growth of bourgeois class, especially through trade, etc. So you can see by the end of the revolution, the American War of Independence, a new state was born, and that state, which you can see in the future, emerged as the world superpower. Even now it continues, even in the present century. So in the next slide here, you can see a map, and I'm here going to talk about the developments that happened in the later half of the 18th century in the area that you can see marked as USA, the United States of America. You can see how it is marked in yellow color. So these this was exactly where the 13 American colonies were there, British colonies were there, and you could see how these 13 colonies, they came together, they fought a war which we actually went on for quite a good number of years, and how at the end of the war they drafted their own constitution, and how the United States of America was born. Okay, now let us see which the 13 colonies were. So you can see that almost all the European powers had colonies across the globe. You could see how the area above the USA that you could see in the map here marked in yellow, above that you have Canada, and Canada was in fact a French possession. So they always had rivalry. Anglo-French rivalry could be seen in this particular part of the continent too. Now you could see how Britain concentrated in a particular area. They established 13 American colonies, and these names you can later study. These are very important because it is good that you have it in your answers when you write. So the colonies were 13 in number. First one, New Hampshire. Second one, Massachusetts. Third, Connecticut. 4, Rhode Island. 5, New York. 6, New Jersey. 7, Pennsylvania. 8, Delaware. 9, Maryland. 10 Virginia, 11 North Carolina, 12 South Carolina, 13 Georgia. So you can study all these names later. Now let us see in the next slide how here this is exactly where these 13 colonies were located. Okay, very close to the seas, so that these were the places where the European traders had reached first. So when they reached first here, you could see they had different interests. Some wanted to propagate Christianity, some wanted to flourish in trade. So they wanted to find new places. So there were different interests that Europeans had when they came to this part of the world, and these were 13 American colonies which Britain possessed in the mainland of America. Now, let us see when the American War happened. So this happened in 3 phases. Let me discuss these phases first and then we'll go to the causes. In this particular class, I'll be dealing with the causes mainly, and in the next class, the cause and the results. So here, before we discuss the causes, let me discuss the 3 phases. So you can see the 3 phases, 1765 to 1775. This was the time when there was resistance against the economic measures of Britain. Then 1775 to 81, the colonies led a war that was under George Washington, when they formed a militia, a very powerful one, and they waged a war. Then the third stage, 1781 to 89, an internal revolution which led to the creation of a federal state. And you could also see how the socio-economic restructuring also happened. The federal state based on the constitution which they drafted. Okay. Now let us see why the American War of Independence happened. It was mainly due to colonial exploitation. It was not a good rule. It was not a rule by the representatives of the people there. The European traders, they came here, they settled here in these areas, and they destroy indigenous cultures. You could see how they kind of asserted their hegemony wherever possible, cultural, political and economic hegemony. And it was a rule of colonial exploitation, like how it happened in our own country, India. You could see the interest was only to take away raw materials. They wanted to sell their finished products in these colonies. So it was a total, it was a period of colonial exploitation. And in the first phase of colonial exploitation, it was very conspicuous, everything was visible, and that stage, that pattern of exploitation can be called as mercantilism. So mercantilism was in fact an economic policy which the colonial powers used in the initial years of establishing their empires, which was actually meant to suppress the colonies through a lot of economic regulations. Very high tariff rates were fixed for goods, custom duties and lots of other duties, tariffs which favored Britain predominantly. So that is what is known as mercantilism. So it was that policy of mercantilism which they followed. And you can see how a lot of commercial acts were also passed. And you can see that has been there from 1650 onwards. A lot of commercial acts which later came to be known as the Navigation Acts. Again, these you have to know were acts which meant to develop or improve the condition of Britain as such, not the colonies. So the colonial businessmen, the British businessmen, enjoyed a lucrative trade which was illicit too. They enjoyed a lot of privileges because it was their government that was in power, and the local people, they suffered, the local traders. Now this sort of colonial exploitation in fact sowed the seeds of revolution in the minds of Americans. Now after 1763, you can see how there was a lot of potential for this particular revolution, and you could see how it came to a head. Now here again in this map, we are talking about the USA, actually, that you know in the map of world map today. And above the USA, it was a French possession in those days, Canada. But you can see that a lot of changes happened after the 7 Years' War that came to an end in 1763. So the 7 Years' War made Britain victorious. Britain was the ultimate winner of the 7 Years' War. That means they did not have that fear of French being there in Canada. So that sort of a change made them more powerful. Until 1763, they were not very aggressive in their issues in the 13 colonies. But once the French menace was put to an end with the 7 Years' War in the year 1763, they started exploiting vigorously even more these 13 colonies. And by this time you have to know that the Stuarts were replaced by another group of rulers, the Hanoverians, and it was King George III who was in power, and he was a ruler who was very obstinate, very arrogant, and he least bothered about what was happening in these colonies, and these colonies were administered by governors according to their own discretion. So you could see how the French menace was totally absent from 1763, and you could see how Britain concentrated more on exploitation, how they could exploit these 13 colonies. So that was how these 7 Years' Wars had an impact in the relationship with the mother country, that is Britain, and the colonies. However, 7 Years' War brought a large amount as debt to Britain, and they wanted to, in fact, find a solution to come out of that crisis. So what they did was again to impose a lot of acts known as the Navigation Acts. And other than the Navigation Acts, they also came up with the Revenue Acts. So Navigation Acts were there, but now Revenue Acts were imposed in these colonies from 1763 onwards. And one such act was 1764, the Sugar Act, by which they imposed tax on sugar, which the people in these colonies had to buy. So that was a Revenue Act. Revenue means to get a revenue for metropolis or Britain. So those people who had to buy sugar had to give an amount as tax, and that went to Britain. No, it was after this particular act that the colonies in fact launched a famous motto which read "No taxation without representation," because they found how all these acts were passed without getting the consent of the people here in the colonies. Everything was decided by the ruler, the king, and their parliament, their traders, the British exclusively, and the common people in the colonies did not have any say in those matters, and that is how they raised the slogan, "No taxation without representation." Okay, now after the Sugar Act, yet another very exploitative act was in 1765, that was a Stamp Act, the Stamp Act. Now what is the Stamp Act? If you wanted to sell your property, or when you're buying a property, you know like how this particular stamp papers are used, and how or for every purchase or sale of land they had to pay a tax. So it imposed stamp duty on legal and commercial documents, which included licenses. So it was this act, the Stamp Act, which offended a lot of people, which included lawyers, builders, tavern owners, printers, etc. Now they decided to boycott British goods. They decided to boycott because they found how this was very exploitative, derogatory, arbitrary, etc. Now it was at this time, after this launching of this the Stamp Act, that a lot of secret organizations were founded against the British government, and one which was led by Samuel Adams, known as the father of American War of Independence, and that was the Sons of Liberty. It was a secret organization because they couldn't of course function openly because they would be punished, so they rather function underground, the secret organizations. Now a meeting of the delegates of the 9 colonies was held in 1765, which began the Anti-Stamp Act Movement. Now they decided to, in fact, these Stamp Act movements, and later how they decided to oppose a lot of moves taken by Britain. But then Britain again was more aggressive. They came up with another act known as the Quartering Act. That was in 1765. Quartering means to station soldiers. So So you find American soldiers all around patrolling, and they also interfered in the privacy of uh, private individuals. Anytime they could enter homes and conduct raids. Anytime they could enter homes and conduct raids. So this actually questioned the privacy which the people had. The Quartering Act, again, which was grossly disliked, that was in 1765. The Quartering Act, I have given an explanation here. Now, yet another notorious act was in 1767, which was passed by Lord Townshend, British officer, and hence it got the name the Townshend Act. The Townshend Act, which imposed a lot of duties on 3-4 items like glass, paper, paint, tea, etc. Now this again was received, not sorry, this was in fact taken by the colony with a lot of uh, what to say, a lot of incidents happened after this particular act was passed in the form of mob violence, because people in these colonies could not digest the idea of such acts, the Townshend Act, which they found again very exploitative, and that led to violence at Boston, which later came to be known as the Boston Massacre. Now, don't confuse it with the Boston Tea Party. I'll be discussing that now later. Now, this is the Boston Massacre. Now, due to all these protests in 1770, Townshend Act got repealed, but the British government decided to continue with the revenue tax on tea. All the other goods they repealed, which were the other goods: glass, paper, and paint. So they kept the tax for tea and repealed all the other taxes on all the other items. Okay. Now you can see how a lot of committees were set up after this particular act was passed, and a lot of prominent leaders like Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, whose name we'll be discussing more, Patrick Henry, etc. Now another act again on tea was passed in 1773. Okay, 1773. It was this particular act which led to the Boston Tea Party, about which you must have studied and must have seen pictures also. Now the Boston Tea Party, what is this tea party? Was it actually a tea party? So this was actually a kind of move which was initiated by the secret organization, the members of the secret organization, the Sons of Liberty, and this happened at Boston in Massachusetts, and that was on this particular incident happened on December 16, 1773. Now they wanted to protest against the Tea Act of 1773. Now what did they do? You could see how all these people disguised as Red Indians, they boarded these ships, and how they in fact threw a lot of cartons full of tea into the sea. So they destroyed lots of tea cartons, tea boxes full of tea, and this was in fact a measure which they had taken because they could not bear any such taxation without representation in any of the bodies, and you could see how, rather than trying to negotiate with the revolutionaries, what King George III and his people did was to again unleash violence. What they did was they closed the Boston seaport as a retaliatory measure. The Boston teapot was closed. This particular incident, by which they destroyed large amounts of tea, they threw these tea cartons into the sea, that came to be known as the Boston Tea Party, and which led to the closure of the Boston seaport actually. So a lot of intolerable acts could be seen after this particular incident. In the next slide you can see an image, and in the next slide again an artist who had depicted it this way, how revolutionaries disguised as Red Indians, they were trying to throw the boxes into the sea. Okay, now when Britain reacted in a very oppressive manner by closing the Boston seaport rather than addressing their grievances, the colonies, they decided to come together. It was when they decided to come together. The representatives of all the colonies came together. 12 colonies First, in 1774, they came together. Other than Georgia, all the colonies sent their representatives. That was in 1774. Okay, so they came together at Philadelphia, and it was then that sense of unity, was very palpable, and you could see how they decided to, in fact, take measures. As to how they could have independence, how they could put out for the foreign rule from their land. So they came together and they discussed about a lot of actions. They were of course very unhappy about the cause of actions taken by the British government, and they decided to chart out a lot of plans against the intolerable acts. Now, the first Continental Congress was held in 1774, then the second Continental Congress was held in 1775, and with that the war began. So you could see how by this time, with the second Continental Congress in 1775, the colonies, they came together, they decided to have an army of their own, and they also organized a native militia, an army of the people known as a Minutemen. Now they had to encounter the British forces very soon at places like Lexington and Concord, and thus the American War of Independence began in 1775 with the Second Continental Congress giving full support to the revolutionaries by military, with all financial help too. That is how the war began. In the next class, we'll be discussing about the cause of the American Revolution and also the impacts. Okay, bye bye.